You wake up. Just yesterday, life was beautiful. Now, half your village is sick, and you have no idea that the world is about to change forever. When picturing medieval Europe, we might imagine towering cathedrals, bustling marketplaces, knights jousting, or humble peasants laboring quietly in the fields. Yet, hidden beneath these familiar scenes lay seismic social shifts triggered by one devastating event: the arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century. Between 1347 and 1351, this deadly plague swept across Europe, reducing its population by as much as half and radically reshaping society in ways that echoed for centuries afterward. The plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia Pestis, arrived from Central Asia along well-trodden trade routes. Merchant ships docked in the port of Messina, Sicily, unknowingly carrying infected rats and fleas. From this initial entry point, the disease exploded across the continent, bringing cities and villages alike to their knees. Death was indiscriminate, affecting rich and poor, noble and peasant, clergy, and laity. Europe's population loss was catastrophic. Contemporary sources describe streets piled high with bodies and entire villages left deserted. Yet beyond the gruesome toll in human lives, the plague's most lasting impact was its transformation of European social structures. Feudalism, once seemingly unshakable, began to fracture under the strain of demographic collapse. Peasant laborers found unprecedented leverage, traditional hierarchies were challenged, and the authority of long-established institutions was thrown into question. What emerged was a Europe gradually reshaped by economic, social, and psychological upheaval, a society forced, quite literally, to rebuild itself from the ground up. In this exploration, we'll uncover how the plague dismantled the feudal order, elevated common laborers into newfound positions of influence, and forever altered Europe's social landscape. Behind familiar images of castles and cathedrals, we'll reveal a continent wrestling with sudden scarcity, rising wages, changing power dynamics, and profound cultural shifts that laid the foundations for Europe's future. Before the devastating outbreak of the Black Death, Europe's social structure was rigid and clearly defined by feudalism, a hierarchical system where power, wealth, and status were closely intertwined. At the top stood the nobility, including kings, dukes, and barons, who controlled vast estates and wielded political authority. Just below the nobility was the powerful clergy, an influential class that managed vast church lands and maintained spiritual authority over the populace. These two upper classes, aristocracy and clergy, often collaborated to maintain social order and their privileged status. At the heart of the medieval economy was the manor, an estate controlled by a lord and farmed by serfs, peasants legally bound to the land. Serfs owed labor obligations, fees, and duties to their lords, working long hours with limited rights or freedoms. They tilled fields, harvested crops, and raised livestock, surrendering much of their production to their masters. Their status was hereditary, and opportunities for advancement were virtually non-existent. Despite this harsh reality, feudalism provided a stable, predictable structure that governed nearly every aspect of medieval life, from economics to politics and personal relationships. Meanwhile, emerging urban centers, cities like Paris, Florence, Venice, and Bruges, offered alternative livelihoods. Within their fortified walls, merchants, craftsmen, and traders created vibrant marketplaces and bustling trade networks. Though cities challenged the feudal hierarchy by introducing greater economic mobility, the countryside remained dominated by the traditional structures of lordship and serfdom. Religion reinforced the feudal order. The medieval worldview emphasized divine providence, teaching that every individual's place in society was ordained by God. The church preached obedience and acceptance of one's social status as a virtue, discouraging open rebellion or widespread discontent. Thus, the combined authority of lord and priest, wealth and doctrine, created a social system deeply resistant to change, until the catastrophic arrival of the plague began dismantling it piece by piece. The Black Death erupted in Europe in late 1347, reaching epidemic proportions swiftly and mercilessly. First appearing in Sicily, the disease quickly radiated outward along trade routes, infecting major port cities like Genoa, Venice, Marseille, and Constantinople. Within a year, it had penetrated inland, sweeping through France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Scandinavia, and the British Isles. Contemporaries chronicled horrors beyond imagination. Entire villages emptied, mass graves hastily dug to accommodate endless corpses, and families reduced to solitary survivors wandering desolate streets. The plague manifested predominantly in three horrifying forms: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic, with bubonic plague characterized by swollen lymph nodes, buboes, the most common. Mortality rates were staggering. Infected individuals typically succumbed within days, suffering fever, delirium, and excruciating pain. Pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs and spread rapidly through coughing and airborne droplets, was nearly always fatal, sometimes killing within mere hours. Contemporary chroniclers estimated death rates at 30 to 50% of Europe's population, with some regions experiencing losses as high as 60 to 70%. Major cities like Florence and London lost more than half their inhabitants, while isolated rural villages were often entirely obliterated. By 1351, when the first devastating wave subsided, Europe's population had plunged from approximately 75 million to as low as 40 million. A demographic catastrophe unprecedented in European history. This profound depopulation had immediate and lasting consequences. With such catastrophic loss, Europe faced a critical shortage of laborers. Fields lay fallow, harvests rotted uncollected, livestock perished unattended, and artisanal workshops sat empty. In the aftermath, survivors were thrust into positions of unexpected opportunity and power, shifting the very balance of Europe's social and economic order. The most immediate and transformative impact of the Black Death was the unprecedented scarcity of labor it created. Before the plague, Europe had a surplus of peasant workers bound to feudal obligations, often subject to harsh and oppressive conditions. Suddenly, however, those surviving peasants discovered their labor was extremely valuable. Lords desperate to harvest their crops or maintain their estates found themselves forced to offer higher wages, improved working conditions, and greater freedoms. Throughout rural Europe, traditional economic arrangements rapidly unraveled. Landowners, accustomed to cheap, abundant labor, attempted initially to resist these changes through restrictive legislation. The English Statute of Laborers in 1351, for example, tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and bind peasants to their land. Similar ordinances appeared across France, Germany, and Italy, as aristocrats fought to uphold their privileged economic position. Yet enforcement proved almost impossible, given the stark economic realities. Peasants simply left estates in search of better conditions elsewhere, willingly risking punishment or fines to assert newfound freedoms. Many migrated to cities where demand for skilled labor was soaring. This mass movement from countryside to urban centers significantly accelerated the decline of feudal serfdom. Traditional manorial estates, unable to maintain their workforce, either adapted by granting peasants their freedom or collapsed economically. The rapid wage increase triggered by labor scarcity was unprecedented. In England, agricultural wages doubled or even tripled within a generation, substantially raising living standards for peasants. Serfs, who once lived at subsistence level, suddenly possessed disposable income, fueling demand for higher quality goods and services. This economic empowerment eroded long-established class barriers, as peasants gained leverage to negotiate directly with lords, fundamentally altering medieval power dynamics. Ultimately, the severe demographic shift caused by the plague forced feudalism into retreat. In its wake emerged a Europe characterized by freer labor markets, more autonomous peasant communities, and an empowered working class, an essential precursor to modern economic systems. The plague's demographic disaster accelerated the growth of Europe's cities, profoundly reshaping its social landscape. Prior to the Black Death, urban centers were growing, but remained secondary to the predominantly agricultural economy. However, The dramatic labor shortage and disruption of rural feudal life rapidly propelled urban growth and significance. Cities offered freedom and economic opportunities unavailable in rural manners. Town authorities, desperate for workers to rebuild economies ravaged by plague, often granted new arrivals privileges such as exemption from feudal dues or personal taxes. Peasants, drawn by promises of higher wages, security, and social mobility, streamed into cities like Paris, London, Bruges, Milan, and Florence, reshaping their demographics and economies. The burgeoning urban populations fueled increased demand for goods, services, and skilled labor. Merchants, craftsmen, and traders, groups already flourishing before the plague, found their influence dramatically amplified. This emerging middle class quickly gained wealth, power, and status through their control of commerce and trade networks. Guilds of craftsmen and merchants strengthened, asserting political power and independence from traditional aristocratic control. City governments became increasingly dominated by middle-class elites, further eroding feudal authority. Economic changes in urban centers created new wealth and reshaped Europe's trade patterns. Demand for luxury items, imported goods, and artisan-crafted products soared, stimulating local industry and international trade. Cities became hubs of innovation, driving technological advancements in textiles, metallurgy, and manufacturing, foundational elements of Europe's eventual industrial revolution centuries later. Thus, urbanization after the plague catalyzed a decisive shift away from feudalism toward an increasingly market-driven economy. Europe's middle class, newly empowered by demographic and economic shifts, would eventually become the driving force behind profound cultural movements such as the Renaissance and Reformation, forever reshaping European civilization. Perhaps one of the most profound yet subtle impacts of the Black Death was the crisis of faith it triggered across Europe. Before the plague, the Catholic Church wielded immense authority, shaping society's understanding of morality, governance, and existence itself. Yet the Church, confronted by an incomprehensible disaster, found its authority significantly undermined. As plague swept Europe, clergy members succumbed at rates equal or greater than the general population. Monasteries, essential centers of education and charity, were decimated. Many priests fled their communities in fear, abandoning parishioners desperately in need of spiritual solace. The Church's inability to offer explanations or effective interventions against the plague's devastating toll severely eroded trust among the faithful. Disillusionment spread rapidly. Radical religious movements gained popularity, most notably the Flagellants, groups who wandered Europe engaging in dramatic acts of public penance, believing such rituals could appease an angry God. Their presence highlighted the desperation and spiritual confusion gripping Europe. Meanwhile, critics within the Church grew vocal. Early reformers like John Wycliffe in England began openly denouncing the Church's wealth, corruption, and failure to serve ordinary believers. Wycliffe's calls for scriptural reform and direct access to biblical teachings resonated deeply, particularly as traditional church structures appeared powerless against the plague's devastation. This growing skepticism toward church authority laid foundational seeds for future religious upheavals. Within 2 centuries, such sentiments would culminate in the Protestant Reformation, an event significantly shaped by the loss of church credibility during the Black Death. Thus, while Europe eventually recovered demographically, the spiritual scars lingered, altering the trajectory of European religion and cultural identity permanently. The plague not only reshaped Europe's broader economic and religious landscapes, it dramatically altered family structures and societal norms at a deeply personal level. With massive mortality, families were torn apart, inheritance patterns shifted abruptly, and traditional social arrangements broke down. The immediate aftermath saw a profound disruption of inheritance practices. Previously, primogeniture, inheritance by eldest sons, dominated, but plague deaths forced inheritance down unexpected pathways. Younger sons, daughters, distant relatives, and even servants found themselves suddenly wealthy or responsible for vast estates. This dramatically reshaped local power dynamics and led to increased mobility and social flexibility. Women, particularly widows, often benefited unexpectedly from these new circumstances. With husbands and fathers deceased, many women assumed control over family estates, businesses, or property. They managed farms, negotiated contracts, and engaged in trade, roles traditionally reserved for men. Such economic empowerment subtly challenged existing gender norms and laid the groundwork for slowly evolving societal expectations of women's capabilities and autonomy. Social norms surrounding marriage also shifted. High mortality rates led many survivors to marry at younger ages or to remarry frequently, rapidly reconfiguring family networks. Additionally, reduced family sizes meant survivors invested more resources and attention in fewer children, subtly changing childhood experiences and expectations. On a societal level, these shifts weakened traditional structures and attitudes, creating space for greater individualism and social fluidity. While full gender equality or radically altered family norms remain centuries away, the Black Death's profound disruption set Europe on a path toward more flexible, adaptive social arrangements, significantly shaping modern European social dynamics. The dramatic social shifts induced by the Black Death also transformed Europe's economic structures, paving the way for the rise of early capitalist systems. Before the plague, European economies were dominated by feudal agriculture, with commerce and industry playing secondary roles. However, the massive labor shortage forced a radical reshaping of economic relations, driving significant innovations that permanently changed Europe's economic trajectory. Immediately following the epidemic, surviving workers enjoyed unprecedented leverage in negotiating their labor conditions. Peasants demanded and secured higher wages, greater freedoms, and better working conditions. For the first time, labor became something negotiated freely rather than dictated strictly by feudal obligations. This new labor mobility created conditions ripe for economic innovation. Landowners, eager to maximize productivity with fewer workers, adopted technological advancements and improved agricultural practices, significantly enhancing productivity per laborer. This economic restructuring extended beyond agriculture into crafts and manufacturing. Skilled artisans became particularly valuable, commanding high wages and driving the development of specialized trades. Cities, bustling with increased commerce and demand for goods, saw artisans organize into powerful guilds, controlling quality standards, production techniques, and pricing. The resulting prosperity enabled cities like Florence, Antwerp, and Amsterdam to become vibrant commercial hubs, profoundly influencing Europe's economic landscape. Additionally, the aftermath of the plague facilitated shifts toward cash-based economies. Feudal rents and obligations, traditionally paid in kind, grain, livestock, labor, began increasingly converting to monetary payments. Lords, desperate to attract tenants to abandoned or unproductive land, accepted cash rents rather than traditional services. This growing monetization of economic life provided a fertile foundation for capitalist practices such as investment, credit systems, banking innovations, and entrepreneurial ventures. Italian city-states like Florence and Venice notably expanded banking and commercial operations, pioneering financial instruments such as bills of exchange, letters of credit, and joint stock ventures. These innovations facilitated long-distance trade, supporting Europe's growing integration into global commerce networks. Thus, the demographic shock caused by the plague inadvertently stimulated economic dynamism, accelerating Europe's transition toward modern capitalist economies and market-driven practices. The profound socioeconomic disruptions following the Black Death inevitably spilled into political realms, triggering widespread unrest and numerous revolts. The sudden empowerment of peasants through higher wages and improved conditions emboldened many to resist attempts by aristocrats to reimpose old feudal constraints. Across Europe, tensions between peasants seeking freedom and nobles struggling to maintain their privileged positions boiled over into violence. One notable event was the French Jacquerie Revolt of 1358. Frustrated by heavy taxation, oppressive lords, and a destabilized economy, French peasants rose violently against local nobility. Armed mobs swept through the countryside, attacking noble estates, looting property, and demanding radical social changes. Although brutally suppressed, the Jacquerie underscored the rising power of common people and their willingness to openly challenge established authority. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 similarly captured the profound political shifts of the era. Sparked by anger over a poll tax and ongoing attempts to limit wage increases, tens of thousands of English peasants, led by figures like Wat Tyler and preacher John Ball, marched on London demanding an end to serfdom and oppressive economic policies. They famously confronted King Richard II directly, pressing demands for justice and freedom. While ultimately quelled by force, the revolt terrified England's ruling class and significantly undermined efforts to maintain traditional feudal authority. Throughout Europe, these revolts demonstrated a significant shift in political consciousness. Peasants, once passive subjects, were now active participants in political struggle, openly challenging social hierarchies. Although most rebellions failed to achieve immediate objectives, their sheer existence compelled aristocratic elites to grant concessions, improve conditions, and gradually dismantle harsher aspects of serfdom. These movements planted early seeds of political awareness among common people, foreshadowing later democratic developments in European governance. The devastating impact of the Black Death extended far beyond social and economic realms, profoundly shaping Europe's cultural and intellectual landscape. Before the plague, medieval culture was deeply steeped in religious tradition, collective community identity, and acceptance of established hierarchies. However, the unprecedented catastrophe triggered profound psychological shifts, reshaping attitudes toward death, life, authority, and the individual. Art and literature vividly captured these changes. Death became a dominant artistic theme, exemplified by the macabre imagery prevalent in medieval frescoes and manuscripts, depictions of dancing skeletons, grim reapers, and scenes highlighting mortality's inevitability. This preoccupation with death reflected Europe's collective trauma, but it also prompted a deeper contemplation of life's value and individual purpose. Intellectual and philosophical shifts also emerged, emphasizing human agency, critical thinking, and empirical observation, core elements of what would later become the Renaissance. As traditional religious and institutional authorities faltered, intellectuals increasingly valued direct observation, experimentation, and secular explanations for phenomena. Scholars revisited classical Greek and Roman texts, previously overshadowed by medieval religious scholarship, drawing inspiration from ancient ideas of humanism, civic virtue, and individual dignity. Cities like Florence, buoyed economically by post-plague prosperity, became centers of this cultural transformation. Wealthy merchant patrons funded artists, scholars, and humanists, supporting cultural revival and intellectual exploration. Figures such as Petrarch, Boccaccio, and later Leonardo da Vinci embodied new Renaissance ideals, valuing individual creativity, scientific inquiry, and personal achievement above collective tradition or blind faith. Thus, Europe's plague-induced trauma catalyzed crucial cultural shifts toward humanism, individualism, and critical thinking. This cultural rebirth, gradually spreading throughout Europe, marked a distinct break from the medieval worldview, laying essential foundations for subsequent scientific and artistic achievements. When we consider medieval Europe, it is easy to overlook the transformative impact of the Black Death behind images of castles, knights, and cathedrals. Yet beneath these familiar symbols lay a profound social transformation sparked by demographic catastrophe. Between 1347 and 1351, Europe's population plummeted dramatically, destabilizing centuries-old systems and reshaping European society forever. Labor shortages dismantled feudal serfdom, empowering peasants and elevating common workers into positions of newfound influence. Urban centers expanded dramatically, nurturing an emerging middle class that challenged traditional aristocratic dominance and fueled early capitalist economic systems. Political tensions erupted into widespread revolts, signaling new political consciousness and popular assertiveness. Meanwhile, the church's spiritual authority eroded, paving the way for later religious reforms. Culturally, Europe's collective trauma inspired new intellectual and artistic currents, promoting humanism, individualism, and scientific inquiry, hallmarks of the Renaissance. Thus, paradoxically, the devastation wrought by plague seeded fundamental changes that shaped modern Europe's social, economic, and cultural trajectory. While subsequent centuries would witness further upheavals, wars, and revolutions, the Black Death marked a definitive turning point, forever altering the continent's history. Ultimately, Europe's recovery from catastrophe revealed humanity's remarkable resilience, adaptability, and capacity for renewal, a testament to society's ability not only to survive disaster, but to emerge transformed and renewed.